Welcome to the Choralosophy Podcast, episode 21. Anyone can get an A in choir. Let's talk about assessment. One of the biggest challenges as I see it facing our field is the fact that many in education don't see our content as an academic subject. How many of you are governed under the, quote, activities umbrella in your school or state? Yet, you can get a PhD in choral music, but you can't get a PhD in football. Choral music is an academic field of study for good reason. It is rigorous, it requires research, practice, and individual skill development to learn and understand it. Disclaimer, this episode is going to include some visual aids, which you won't need in order to enjoy the podcast, but I will mention them throughout the podcast so that if you're watching on the YouTube channel, you're going to be able to see some of my rubrics on the screen. And if you want to have some copyable and customizable versions of the files that I use, those are going to be available on the Patreon page. That's patreon.com/choralosophy. For anyone who is a subscriber on my Patreon, those files are going to be available and I'll share them with you, help you create something that works for you in your classroom. So head over to patreon.com/choralosophy if you'd like to have the files, and to the YouTube channel to watch this episode later if you would like to simply see them for free and use them in that context. I believe that one of the reasons that our education colleagues don't see us as an academic subject on par with theirs in the math department or the history department is the way that we grade. I think there are other factors, and I don't want to jump into this episode leading you to believe that I think that this is the magic bullet that gets us core subject status. But I do think it is one of the factors that other academic subjects see us as less than an academic subject for a couple reasons related to the way we grade. Number one, we are notorious, generation after generation, for giving everybody an A. In fact, it's one of the reasons that parents want their kids to take choir. And one of the reasons that their kids want to take choir is because it's, quote, an easy A. We've been fighting that reputation for a long time. And of course, that we have that reputation, just like all stereotypes, there's just a little bit of a grain of truth, right? Just enough truth to where people tend to think that and they don't see any reason why it's not true. So they see our students mostly getting A's with very little individual accountability, and part of that is due to the fact that we've rationalized it, I think, over generations as it's a group project, it's a group effort. Everyone's welcome, which is true, but that is not the same thing as everyone's welcome, but you are also accountable to perform at a certain level, to show improvement, and to be tested individually, to show individually that you know your material, etc. I think our colleagues don't see enough of us doing that. And I think in a lot of places, the reality from what I've seen and the types of questions I've seen asked online and had other colleagues talk about, these things aren't commonplace in the choir world yet. The idea that individual students are going to be graded individually on their own singing ability. So in this episode, I'm going to walk us through some systems that have worked really well for me to balance the idea of performing goals, as well as my accountability to each student to hold them accountable. I think that's a really important part of it that sometimes we miss. We as teachers, we owe it to them to give them a clear and accurate picture of how it is that they're doing. We will talk about daily rehearsal grades and why I don't grade on participation. I think that is the absolute wrong way to go. We will talk about grading kids on the quality of their singing, both alone and in groups. And we will also talk about moving past showing up is enough at concerts. There are grades to be earned on concert night also. So by increasing the rigor and accountability in your classroom, you may experience a backlash at first. It will take time to adjust, and you might lose a student who doesn't want to take a class that is hard. Sometimes, like I said earlier, they do want the class because they see it as an easy A, but if you frame this the right way, they will give it a chance. So it's in the way that you communicate. Hey guys, this is why we are introducing this new assignment this year, or this new test, this new assessment. I've seen that this works. I've seen other choirs that have tried this. I listened to this podcast, and I was convinced, right? But if you provide the right rationale, kids will buy into it. Because the reality is that the student who is riding on the coattails of a stronger singer next to them in a choir rehearsal every day and at the concert, they are smart enough to know that the A they get that matches the A of that kid next to them who's doing most of the work is an unearned A. And most humans will accept an unearned gift, but deep down, after a long period of time, unearned things start to weigh on our self-conscious, and they start to weigh on our self-esteem. So one of the things that I wanted to communicate before I get too far into this episode in the nuts and bolts is that anything I communicate on an episode like this is a continuation of the sight reading episode I did, episode 18, Ripping Off the Band-Aid, which has been my most popular episode, as I mentioned before. It was kind of a surprise to me. People just gobbled it up. And it did generate actually some controversy, and I thought I'd mention that first before I get too far into this. It was controversial. I've done episodes on race. I've done episodes on transgender stuff. I've done episodes on all the hot button social issues, which to me, I thought would be the ones that got the most angry feedback. But so far, that's not the case. It's really been fascinating. I've put out there some, heterodox opinions about all of these things, but it was my episode about how you shouldn't play notes for kids and you shouldn't make recording tracks for kids that got the most negative feedback. And the one of the things that I've heard and has been, in fact, I won't say names, but there was a conversation back and forth in a thread on I'm a Choir Director the other day between someone who I thought of as a friend, I still do. I thought this was a very strange conversation. Somebody had asked about the issue of what do I do when I've been playing the parts for the kids in a rehearsal over and over and over and over and over, and as soon as we put the piano accompaniment with the piece, they fall apart and they can no longer sing their part. Well, I immediately jumped on and I said, well, one of the things that we should do is stop playing the notes for them. And I did put a link to the episode in there because, of course, that's what podcasts are. They are in-depth explanations of why. On social media, it's hard to get a 90-minute or a 60-minute explanation into something. And as we all know, this is complicated. Right? But one of the reasons that I made that suggestion is that if kids learn the music by hearing the piano and following it, it stands to reason that when you change the piano part to the piano accompaniment, they're going to start following that because that's what they've been taught to do. They've been taught to listen to something and sing what they hear instead of course, what I've advocated for, which is to look at what they see on the page, hear it in their head, and then sing that. Because in my experience, kids who can do that can hear all kinds of weird things going on around them and still sing notes. Just the other day, I had my concert choir kids have the men read in D sharp and the women read in the key of D, half step apart from each other. It wasn't perfect, but they could stay in the keys that they started in because they've developed this ability to hear the pitch in their head, sing a note that they see regardless of what is going on around them. So this is an important concept, and what was interesting is the person jumped onto the thread and said that they disagreed with me and that choir directors need to use the tools that are at their disposal when they have time constraints to learn music. And the reality is the piano is the fastest way for some directors to get the kids to learn the notes. And I simply replied that I disagree. I disagree that the piano is the foremost, fastest tool that we have to teach the kids the notes. And I articulated in this conversation that I have done it both ways. I've been directing for 17 years now, and I did it about 9 years the other way. I grew up having notes played for me, so I got to teaching and I started teaching that way, and all the notes were played. And I know from having done it now 7 years or so, 6, 7, or 8 years, the other way where we ripped off the Band-Aid and stopped playing notes, that the kids are way faster without the piano because it's something that's internalized. They've learned to internalize it. And anyway, this conversation kind of devolved into me being accused of only wanting to talk about this so that people will listen to my podcast, which of course, sure, fair. Am I trying to promote a podcast? Am I trying to run a business with this thing? Yes, I am. I need people to listen. But as I made clear from the very beginning to those of you who've been listening all along, everything I talk about on here is going to be what I genuinely believe to be true. Any products that I promote, any companies that I work with, are companies that I use, right? So you can, yeah, fine. That is absolutely one of my motivations. I want people to listen to the podcast, and I'm not embarrassed about that. I'm not going to pretend that that's not true. But I posted that episode link for that person, that other choir director, to see and to listen to, because I've been also told by way more people than were critical. I've gotten tons of feedback on that episode that it was helpful to them. And so I thought maybe this would be helpful. If your kids are following the keyboard, they will follow whatever it plays. So you're going to be playing the notes for them at the concert in many cases, if we don't rip off the Band-Aid. So I find that interesting, and in fact I did an episode earlier on about what the way we discuss things when we don't agree as being so critical to the whole collegial process. I think, and I believe that, and I try to live it out. I try to live it out even when I'm online with conversations with people, and I believe that I've done a pretty good job. I, of course, will echo again my call for you to call me out if I don't, because I want to be held accountable for speaking with civility, speaking with patience, speaking with the assumption that the other person wants what's best and has good motivations. And I will always assume that about other people unless they flat out give me facts about that they don't have good intentions. Right? I wish bad things on you. Well, of course, then I would believe you. I would believe that you have bad intentions. But for the most part, I believe that people have good intentions. So I think that's the method that I'm going to use on this show. And I do find it fascinating, though, that so far I've gotten more heated blowback from what I consider just to be nuts and bolts about how to teach choir. And I think here's the nut of the nut and bolt in my mind. On this show, I will say what I believe to be true. If you disagree, that's okay. But at the same time, it's my show. So I will say what I believe to be true, and I love the idea of somebody listening to something on this show, disagreeing, and respectfully sending me an email and saying, hey, I don't see it that way. Here's how I see it. Can we talk about that? And I would probably volunteer to record that conversation and post it on a show. Because that's the whole point of this project for me. It's got to pay its bills. Absolutely. It's a business, but this is that's a side hustle for me. As you all know, I'm a choir teacher. This is what I do. And so it's only fun for me if it's a conversation, right? So this is something I find so strange about collegial interactions overall, because it's just not a bone that I have in my body. If you disagree with me about something, it's not going to hurt my feelings. It's just not. But yet I know that I'm weird in that way. That there are people who, if they hear me say, I believe that it is wrong to play notes for kids because it stunts their growth, their academic growth, their intellectual growth. I've even read about the neuroscience involved in music reading and its benefits, and anything that we can do to make sure that that is spinning on all cylinders is what we should be doing. I believe that to be true. If you disagree, let's talk about it. But what I find interesting is that we still are in this place where disagreement means an attack. Or in this case of the conversation that I'm discussing, I was told that my view was single-minded. Meaning it's like, oh yes, if you believe something to be true, you must be single-minded. Well, everyone does. Everyone believes that something is true about something, right? So actually, one of the funniest philosophical jokes that you won't think it's funny, but I'm going to say it anyway because I think it's funny. The idea that there's a whole philosophical movement where that called postmodernism mostly, where truth doesn't exist. Like there is no objective truth. But one of the funniest things to me is how vehemently a postmodernist will argue with you the truth about there being no truth, right? So it's a ridiculous idea on its face. Of course there is something that is true. We might not have access to it, but of course there is. There has to be something that is true. If a tree falls in a forest and no one is there to hear it, yes, it makes a sound. Things vibrate, whether there's a human there to observe them or not. Anyway, I'm going off on the rails, but the point is, I'm going to outline these things in this episode that I believe are the right way to grade, because I've graded a whole bunch of other ways, and I've seen a whole bunch of other ways, and I've heard about people's horror stories about the way they grade, and I don't experience any of those things. And partly the reason I think I have a good experience with grading and helping kids see their actual growth is because of these things. If they mean nothing to you and you don't think they're helpful, don't use them. Or maybe if one of the things is useful to you, then use that. But I hope you enjoy and find this interesting. I'm going to walk you through, I'm going to show you some of my rubrics and use some screen images and all kinds of stuff coming up real soon if you're watching on the YouTube channel. But if you're listening on the podcast, I will do my best to, of course, verbalize everything so that you can understand what it is that we're doing in all the rubrics in my choir class. Thanks so much for listening. I'm just going to take a brief pause to shout out some of my sponsors for this show. I'm so fortunate to have all of them on board, and we are so fortunate as a listening community to have access to these products at a discounted rate. GraphitePublishing.com is a website that has a ton of amazing choral music available at your fingertips. You can have copies in your hands in seconds from composers like Eric Barnum, Jocelyn Hagan, Tim Takash, Joshua Shanks, so many more. And you can sift through all their music by difficulty, by instrumental accompaniment, by duration. Great search engine on there, and you can download the PDFs and pay for the number that you want and enter Choralosophy at checkout. You'll get 10% off there, just like you will at SightReadingFactory.com. If you have not yet gotten your membership for the year for all of your students, I strongly encourage you to give them that at-home practice tool as well as for use in your class. So you get a membership for yourself, and for the number of students you have, they each get a code, and they can go on their Chromebooks or their phone app and practice as much as they want at home. So I encourage you to do that. Get your kids signed up today and go on to SightReadingFactory.com and enter Choralosophy at checkout. Finally, RyanMain.com is a self-publishing website that Ryan has put his music up there that you can get a site license for each of his pieces for one fee and download and print as many as you want, which is a really cool, innovative idea. Same deal there for my listeners. You can enter Choralosophy at checkout and get 10% off. So head over to those sites and check out those products, and we are going to move right along now to talking about grading kids on sight reading individually. So I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about the way and the why, I suppose you could say, about the individual sight singing assessments, which, well, at first, for those of you watching on the YouTube channel, I'm going to address the elephant in the room. Yes, between the last clip and this clip, I have less beard. It was out of control. I apologize for its out of control nature. It's trimmed now, and it'll grow back, and it'll be out of control again in a few months. For those of you on the podcast, you don't care, but I just thought I'd throw that out there. So, individual sight singing. In episode 18, that was about sight singing specifically, I talked about the concept of teaching sight singing as part of our warm-up every day, which we should. We all should have some kind of literacy element, I think, at the beginning of or in the middle of, doesn't really matter where, but some part of the class every single day. However, if the main method for learning the song is not the literacy that you're teaching them during that literacy exercise, you're wasting your time. We talked about that a little bit, so this will be the recap. So if a student can hear notes being played on the piano and within milliseconds respond by singing what they hear, and tell you they're reading, but in fact they are not reading, they're following. The same line of logic then would take you to what happens when you are doing those literacy exercises, and let's say you put Sight Reading Factory up on the screen, like I do, and play the starting pitch, and they can find all their notes a cappella, they can do the whole thing, they're doing it as a group. Well, someone in there, many of the students probably, are simply doing the other activity that I described, which was to hear someone around them singing, and then within a millisecond follow them. Well, that means some kids in there, even though you are reading and you're doing all the things I said to do in Measure 18 or in Episode 18, not all the students are reading. Most of them are, but not all of them are. And so just like any other activity in school, we've got to be able to find a way to individually assess the kids' learning and growth and not let them think they've learned to read music over the course of a whole school year when they in fact have not, but they've learned to follow very closely to what their neighbors have done. And we've heard this for years in choir. It's probably the biggest age-old excuse in choir, which is, oh, I can sing it when other people are singing it. Okay, try that in math. Like, I can do this equation when I'm watching him do it. Well, then you can't do the equation. And I don't know why we think choir is any different or music is any different. It's something that any learning only happens in the individual child's mind. So that's kind of the philosophical underpinning of why I test each kid on sight singing. The other reason is it works. It makes them better. When they know that they're going to have to do it on their own, they work at it. They actually, and then they think about it differently in class too when they're doing it. They're more mentally engaged. They're less likely to be the one that is following along. Instead, they're more likely to be mentally plugged into the process of reading. Okay, so what we do is in October, which is actually for us is going to be next week. I'm recording this episode in mid-October. We are going to pull each kid, and it is a sacrifice of a couple days in a big class, but each kid gets about 2 minutes in a practice room for them to pull up a Sight Reading Factory exercise. We just kind of meet factory style, one after another, assembly line, pull them into the practice room, give them the tonic, do only. They sing their scale and arpeggio just like we do in class, and we see how they do. It's a pretest. It's not for a grade. We just want to see what level of Sight Reading Factory is this kid reading right now. Okay, so we have them in 9th grade. So when they start this in 9th grade, there are some kids who aren't reading at all, right? So they get the exercise by themselves, and even though we've practiced it every day in class up until October, mid-October, they are unable to do it at all. In which case, that kid might get their pretest set at level 1, which means we tell them, okay, you're struggling here by yourself. By December, you need to be able to read a level 1. Here's a password, your individual code. Go home and practice them. Record yourself. Go back and grade yourself. That kind of thing. Get ready for the test, just like any other teacher in any other class would do, right? So they get that access. They know where they're going to start. We do also have, on the flip side of that, freshmen that come in there. Maybe they're a band or orchestra, or maybe they just pick things up quickly, and they fly through a level 2. Right, at their very first pretest, and it's perfect and was not even a challenge for them at all. Well, then we're going to put their December final at a level 3, okay? Because again, I don't care where they start, they're going to get better by their final. That's their expectation. They all get graded in the same way, but on different levels. So it is tailorable to the individual child's needs. It's focused on the individual student, and it's growth focused. So the kid who nails a level 5 and the kid who nails a level 1 can both get an A. They can both get an A, but because they need to demonstrate that they've grown over time. We've even had some kids where if pitch matching is an issue on their first pretest, we might tell them that singing the scale and arpeggio and not changing keys is their first semester final. So because obviously if they can't do that, they can't read a level 1, right? So there is and that kid can still get an A, by the way. If they achieve their goal, by the time their final happens, they can get an A, and we have a rubric that we grade all of this with to determine a letter grade. So it's not as scary as it sounds. So the other philosophy behind that we use, which is kind of unique. So a lot of you guys have district choirs in your area and all state choirs that have a sight reading component. And of course, in a lot of those cases, a judge is sitting there with each measure, each measure goes by, kind of like Guitar Hero, and you either got it or you didn't get it, and you lose points every time you have a measure that's not correct, right? So I don't grade that way at all, partly because that's not realistic to how choir rehearsals go. You know, what choir rehearsal flies all the way through a song and then goes back and talks about every single little mistake? I mean, I don't know any good conductor that does that. Instead, you rehearse little portions of a song. You talk about things that are going wrong or going right, and you tweak and you work and you stop and hold chords, and there's all kinds of things that go on in there. And to only talk about the notes and rhythms being wrong on a nitpicky level throughout all of that, if that's the only thing you're talking about, you're spinning your wheels. So ultimately, what kind of rehearser do we want? We want kids who are self-fixing their notes and rhythms problems. So our rubric is set up that way. So on the rubric that we use, so again, I'll kind of tie this all together. Once we've set in October what their level is to start, we're going to expect progress from that point on. And we're going to then have them come in December, and for a grade, they're going to read whatever level we set them at. And there's a 3-point rubric. It's either a 0, a 1, or a 2. A 2 means that they sang all of the notes and rhythms correctly, all of them, right? So the entire exercise, 100% correct, with no help from the teacher. Okay, so let me give you an example of that. Okay, so this will be my impersonation of a high school, probably freshman baritone, taking his final, and he's going to get a 100% on my final, a 50 out of 50. Now the points doesn't matter, you have your own system for points. Do, re, mi, fa, mi, re, do, ti, la, sol, la, ti, do, mi, do, fa, la, fa, do, mi, do, do. And I give them 20 seconds to audiate. I'll skip that part. Do, ti, do, re, mi, fa, do, re, mi, fa, mi, do, re, do, ti, do, re, mi, mi, do, mi, do. So as you could hear, did I sing it from the start to the finish with no mistakes? No, I did not. That was intentional, by the way. Those of you haters out there, he's a choir director, he can't even sight read. Okay, but so the students will make mistakes, and partly because they're nervous, partly because they just make mistakes. So did I make mistakes? Yes, I did. Did I fix them? Yes, I did. And did I need a teacher to step in and tell me I made a mistake and help me figure out what that sounds like, what the correct answer sounds like? No. So all of that stuff I did on my own. I was independently reading. I was independently fixing, at which point the exercise is over, and I just got 100% on my final. Okay, so mistakes and all. And what I've noticed that does is it takes a lot of the nerves away. So I've heard people talk about how they don't want to do something like this in their class because they don't want to put kids in a position where they're being evaluated where their nerves would be the cause of them to not get a good grade. First thing I would say to that is that is going to be true in every class. There are kids who are nervous during all tests, that the testing itself makes them nervous, at which point do we want to say, should school not have tests at all? We have to have some way to assess whether or not they are learning and they are getting better, right? So is their progress happening? So by this testing in this method, I've discovered that the nerves are dramatically reduced. than versus the old system, so to speak, or the all district choir type system of just tallying mistakes. Why? Because then the mistakes snowball the anxiety to the point where, oh, I've messed up 3 times already. My grade is X. I can't get better. It's over. Like, I've already failed. And then, of course, you're not really evaluating their ability to fix and or rehearse. And it's the fixing, the self-fixing, like I said before, that is really the skill, I think, that we all want from our students. We don't want them to be perfect. I mean, well, let me rephrase that. We'd love it if they were perfect, but we don't expect them to be perfect, right? So we've seen that they can work their way through their problems independently. And then our rehearsals, when they all start to develop this ability, our rehearsals just go so much faster because the director doesn't have to stop and talk about every wrong note anymore. It becomes something the students are responsible for on their own, and they start marking their own mistakes and going back and fixing it later, that kind of thing. So this is the skill we're developing. So on the rubric that I use, that kid gets a 2, the one you just heard. A 1 would be, I'm not going to demonstrate this one because it's the same concept. So a 1 is a student who did what I just did and sang all the way through. They got all the notes and rhythms right, but in a few of the instances, in any instance, the teacher had to step in and help, whether it be, so towards the end of the exercise, you heard me sing incorrectly, the descending sa, mi, do, and if I never quite could get the mi, for example, and I kept just going to the end, the teacher's going to step in and because the kids got to still get all the notes right, or else they can't get that 1 level. So we're going to say, nope, okay, so here's so, mi. Can you find do? The kid would sing do. Now, okay, now go back and do that last measure again and see if you can fix it. And then they go back and they fix it, but they needed the teacher to kind of guide them through why they were wrong, okay? At which point they're a 1 on the rubric. So I do 50 points for this test. 50 out of 50 is a 2. Cut and dry. If they get it all by themselves, then they get their 100%. I do 30 to 49 points. Anywhere in that range is what a 1 would be. And the high end of that at 49 might be the scenario I just described, where they just needed me to jump in and help with one thing, like just one little interval or one little rhythm, or I had to get them back in the right key like once, but then once I did that, they were fine, that kind of thing. Then I might give them a 49, because does this kid still read? Yes, he does. Yes, she does. But there was a mistake, and that's where that little point shaves off. Okay, all the way down to a 30, which means they were able to sing the exercise, but a 30 would probably at that end of the scale would probably mean that I was jumping in to help them a lot. All right, so I'm coming in every measure maybe to get them. Fix a rhythm, to fix an interval, to hold something for its full value, that kind of thing. And so that would be still a 1 on my rubric, but at the low end of 1. All right, so they're going to get a 30. Now a 0 on the rubric means, and also has a point range for their grade, for their letter grade, because of course we're not putting rubric grades in their report cards in our district. But the 0 on a rubric means that they were not able to sing the exercise correctly, just any part of it. So they've got, in order to get a 1, they've got to still sing everything correctly. But a 0, in the time that we have in the room, they were not able to get it all. Okay. Now the point range could be 0 to 29. I don't give very many zeros in points because that would reflect a kid who just refused to do it. Which, when we first started doing this test, I did have some of those. Like, I'm not going to do this. Okay, you get a 0 then, and that's how they chose to process it. We don't get zeros anymore, because now a 0 would mean that they come in to do their test and they won't make any singing sound at all. Maybe they just kind of say do, re, fa, clearly not making any effort, right? Now a 0 on the rubric happens relatively frequently, and that just means they can't quite ever sing it in the right key. They can't ever quite recreate maybe a 1-chord arpeggio that might happen to be in the level 2 exercise, that kind of thing. But it doesn't happen very often. Most of our kids fall, especially by their second time they do the test, and we do this at the end of every semester. We're getting very few zeros after only 1 semester really of doing this, because again, it's about putting them at the right level. So if you put a kid, if for example, when I first started doing this, This was probably 7 or 8 years ago, maybe 10, I don't remember, but at least 7 years ago. Back then, I was still trying to work it all out, and so I had a system in place where every single freshman did a level 2, every single sophomore did a level 3, every single advanced choir kid did a level 4 as their starting test. And over time, I've evolved more into individualizing it, and it took a little bit more time out of class to assess that individual level, but it's made a huge difference, because now even the kid who comes in, and we've all got these kids that come in and they are self-defeating, and they've already told themselves before they even get to our class that they can't sing, and they're just going to try to mumble and get their fine arts credit. Even the quote-unquote worst readers in the room discover that they can make progress and that they can get better. And once they believe that they can get better, the progress is pretty amazing. So I encourage everybody to, at the very least, try to move to a system where kids are assessed on their own individual sight singing ability. Makes a huge difference in the rehearsal, and it makes a huge difference in their self-esteem. All right, next up, even though sight singing is not evaluated individually in my class frequently, it's a big deal for them. It's on their final, and there's all the preparation that we do in class leading up to that. But the bulk of their grade comes from how they rehearse. I call them rehearsal skills. So next up, I'm going to kind of walk you through the rubric verbally and visually of how about 50% of my students' grades are calculated. So I'm going to talk you through this rehearsal skills tracker for a week that I created that uses the rubric that we publish for the students in our syllabus, but this is a document that they can interact with. I've printed these out and put them in their folder. It allows them to self-grade. So you can see all the language on this one is first person, and the numbers that you can see here if you're watching on the YouTube channel are representative of our district's curriculum. So you can kind of ignore those. I'm going to share this document on the Patreon page also so that you can make your own copy of it. So Patreon supporters will have access to all of the documents listed and discussed in this episode. If you're listening on the podcast, I'm just going to start kind of talking you through each of the categories. And this is how I've been grading in the school. I've been grading for quite a while, probably, close to 10 years. These were rubric points, and I've kind of used them in my own way, as any teacher would. And so what I intend to do is just kind of walk you through how this rubric works. And if it's useful to you, then you could modify it and or try some of these things. And what I've found in the time that we've been using this is that it has pretty dramatically changed the way the kids think about rehearsal. So one of the things that I do is I don't grade on participation. At the beginning of the year, I ask the kids to raise their hand and just take a wild guess. What do you think you're going to get graded on in choir? And almost always the first answer is participation. And I say no, and they look really shocked. And I say, no, we don't grade on participation, and here's why. Participation means different things to different people. You could be, quote, participating by simply making noise inside of your head that only you can hear, and your mouth's not moving, and there's a song everyone else is singing, and you're making noises, and everyone's making noises, and then the teacher says, hey, no, Tommy, we really need you to sing. You can't just stand there. Well, I'm singing. Well, okay, so noise was happening. Was he making any effort at all? No, and then so what happens, you go down a rabbit hole as a teacher arguing with a kid about whether or not they are singing or not, or whether or not they're participating. So the reason we don't grade on participation is the definition of that for the kid might be different than it is for you as the teacher. So this document kind of helps make it objective, helps make it observable and quantifiable. So what we do is we have these 4 buzzwords for all of the rubric categories. The buzzwords are consistently, which means all of the time; frequently, which means most of the time; occasionally, which we describe to the kids as hit and miss, like so maybe 1 out of every 2 opportunities you're doing what you're supposed to be doing; and rarely, which means almost never or never do I see you doing these things. So on Monday, a student could say, today I frequently demonstrated proper body alignment. Okay, so they would use their pencil probably, it's easier, or a Chromebook. You could type frequently demonstrated proper body alignment. And of course, you have to define all these things for them the way you would ahead of time on the first day of school. What does body alignment look like, and what's correct and what's incorrect? And they could grade themselves. Now, of course, you should be grading them too. There's your own opinion. It won't always match. But that might be the kid who, most of the time, they're standing the way they're supposed to stand, or sitting the way they're supposed to sit, but they have inconsistent application of that skill, and maybe a few times they kind of got lazy. And all right, what is your standard? Mine's pretty tough, but I'll talk about that in a second. So then the next category that you might have said, today I rarely made adjustments to the vocal score through the use of a system of rehearsal markings. So I'm going to say that again for those of you on the podcast. Made adjustments to the vocal score through the use of a system of rehearsal markings. This is how we grade whether or not they use their pencil. And how do they use their pencil? So we define this as teacher says something about the music that needs to be remembered for tomorrow. Did you get out your pencil and mark it without being told to get out your pencil and mark it? If I have to come to Tommy and say, did you hear me say the thing about the breath mark at measure 32? Yeah. Okay, so could you mark it with your pencil? Well, that doesn't count. So in other words, they're getting no credit for did I walk you over to you directly, stop rehearsal, and say, get out your pencil and write that thing that I said down. This is self-initiated behavior. The same goes for body alignment. If I'm telling you to stand up straight, then you're not self-initiating that behavior. So that reduces where you fall on the rubric. So far, I've had this hypothetical student, his name apparently is Tommy, that was not planned ahead of time, but Tommy so far has frequently demonstrated proper body alignment for the day. He has rarely made adjustments to the vocal score through the use of a system of markings. Now the next category, today we're going to say he did a really good job at this. So today I consistently demonstrated an understanding of sound and silence and the role of each in an effective rehearsal or performance. I consistently demonstrated an understanding of sound and silence and the role of each in an effective rehearsal or performance. So what do you think we're grading here? We are grading whether or not they talk when they're not supposed to talk. But it can also apply to whether or not they are making any effort to make the right type of sound in the rehearsal. So typically, and this is the trap that choir teachers fall into so frequently, another reason we don't grade on participation, because a lot of times these behavior things that are so common in choir, like the talking during rehearsal and not being on task, ends up being graded at a lot of schools in the citizenship category and does not affect their academic grade. Well, using this language, we've been able to justify why it does affect their academic grade. It's a rehearsal skill, and if you're talking while I'm talking, or if you're, heaven forbid, talking while we're singing something, the noises you're making are not written on the paper. They're not written on the music, so they're the wrong answer. In the same way that in a math class, 2 plus 2 is not 5. You just gave the wrong answer. We're trying to create a certain sound in the rehearsal, and when you make extra noises that are not part of the song, you are not making the correct type of sound. You're not making an effort of making the right type of sound, or if you're intentionally not using your full voice to create a forte sound, all those types of things. If you're having a trouble with students doing this, rather than arguing about whether or not they're doing it, you simply reflect consistently how frequently they're doing it. So Tommy, in this case, is doing a good job. He's consistently not talking when he's not supposed to be talking, and when it's time to sing, he sings. So we have one more category. Today, I was, and these usually go together, we're going to also give him a good score here. I was consistently engaged in the rehearsal. Okay, so again, consistently means all the time, and engaged we define as, where are your eyeballs? Are you looking where you're supposed to look? Are you mentally plugged into the activity that we are doing? And are you physically engaged? So it's not just mental engagement, but it's mental and physical. If we are talking about the process of breath, and everyone else's rib cage and abdominal muscles are moving, and yours are standing totally still and not making any effort to move, unless you have a note from the doctor, you are not engaged in the rehearsal. You might be paying attention mentally, but if you're not making your body do the thing that we're doing, then you're not physically engaged, and so you'd be losing those points as well. So this is where it gets to be a real challenge for the kids at first. Once they get through this part, though, they can really get it. So here's how we turn that into a grade. For every consistently that the kids get on their box, they get a 10. This is out of 10. Okay, so for every consistently, it's 10. For every frequently, it's 7. For every occasionally, it's 5. And for rarely, it's less than 5, depending on the teacher's discretion. So it could be all the way down to 0, could be 1 or 2, and it just depends on how rarely. So you can see right there, we've valued at 10 out of 10 is an A, which means you're doing all 4 of those things all of the time. If you go to a most of the time person, to being a most of the time person, you are now getting a C. Now, of course, that averages, because we know kids are going to have good days and bad days. So what we tell them is that it's okay that you're not perfect. Some days you will have a bad day. But over the course of time, what's going to get you an A in the class is if you are an all-the-time person, most of the time. Right? Nobody's perfect, but if you look at a 5-day week, and so as you can, those again, if you're watching on the YouTube channel or if you go to the Patreon page and have your own copy of this that you can create and play with, then you're seeing that over the course of a whole week, there are lots of opportunities to either pull down your average or pull them back up. So let's go through and grade Tommy today. So on Monday, he got a 7 out of 10. I'll give him a 3 for his rarely, and a 10 and a 10. So that's 30 out of 40, which gives him an average of 7.5. So on his Monday grade, his grade would have been 7.5 out of 10. And that's how our grade goes into the gradebook. We aggregate them over 2 weeks. So when 100 points goes in, so 10 points a day, 50 points a week. So if he were to perform that way, rehearse that way, I should say, every single day, his grade for those 2 weeks would be a 75%. So he would be getting a C in my class. And again, keep in mind, the student we just described is almost always standing up straight. He is consistently paying attention and not talking, but he's getting a C. Why? Because he's not using his pencil in rehearsal. In order to get an A in our class, you have to do all those things at a pretty high frequency to pretty close to all the time. And again, that might seem really harsh, but it works because when the kid isn't doing what they're supposed to be doing in order to get an A, all you have to do is ask them, have them fill out this form, because they'll tell you, yeah, no, I guess I didn't use my pencil much today. There were lots of things we talked about, I just didn't write any of it down. Okay, well, that's why you have a C and not an A. And then they understand it's not you telling them that they're just a C student in choir. It's they then know, and parents then know, hey, Tommy, why didn't you use your pencil in choir? You know that's one of the things that you have to do to get an A. Just do it. Well, then you start to have more of that parent support. So just to take this concept one step out further, I'm not going to go all the way through this chart. You can kind of figure out the idea, but over the course of an entire week, let's say by Wednesday, he's gotten his act together with the pencil thing, and he's gotten his to the point where he's more consistently on most of the days consistently aligning his body. He's starting to pull 10 out of 10 on all these other days. Now his C from Monday might average out to that A minus or an A for the rest of the week if he gets his act together. And that's the other great part about the system that I found, is if I give them this feedback and this self-assessment early in the year on exactly why your grade is the way it is, then it puts the power in their hands to fix it. Okay, another area of grading that I think is really important and maybe gets some love around the choir world, but I don't know that it's consistently applied, is the idea of a choir student being asked to, in a testing environment with some pressure, demonstrate that they have learned their music and that they are not simply following off of the neighbors that are around them. Because as I discussed back in episode 18, the ability of a student to play, or to hear, someone singing or playing a part, and within milliseconds simply mimic what they are hearing is pretty sophisticated, and that creates this idea in our classes that, oh, I can sing it with other people, but don't make me sing it by myself. And we've kind of, I think, developed a mythology around the idea that that's all students can do, like that there are some kids that just cannot learn to sing independently. They have to have someone else around them. Now, there might be exceptions to this in the case of some kids with IEPs or other types of learning disabilities. But I think in most cases, this might be hard for some people to hear, I think most cases it's just that they're doing exactly what we're expecting them to do. And if we don't expect that they can do it, well, then they can't do it. So what we do is we test all of our students once per quarter, once right before each concert is happening. We pick out maybe 20 to 30 measures from each song that we're singing. Some songs might not get tested. It just kind of depends on the nature of the song itself. We don't really feel the need to test it, or just doesn't make sense and too hard to do in a small group. It's got too much percussion going on. You know, those types of considerations might play into it. But for the most part, we'll grab a little segment of each piece. Usually, depending on voicing, we'll do things that are 3 or 4 parts. That way the test goes by quicker. But essentially what we do is we come down to the front of the classroom, everybody sits down on the risers, 2 people from each part come forward, and we grade them based on the following rubric, and I'm going to walk you through how all of this works in detail. But essentially we set up what would look like a small ensemble for a lot of you at your solo and ensemble festivals and at the high school level, but this is a testing method that I think could work really well at the collegiate level also. So you're creating a small, octet or sextet, depending on the voicing of the piece. In my advanced choir, sometimes we try to grade 16 of them all at once, but we avoid that. Just because, for the obvious reasons, the ability to track and grade everybody fairly along this rubric, when there's that many kids, the music's got to be pretty darn simple and clear at that point. So the preference is 2 on a part with maybe 4 parts or 3 parts going on, so that you can really test the kids on the way they're singing and not just the notes and rhythms. So I'm going to zoom in here so that you can see this really clearly. If you're watching on the YouTube channel again, you'll be able to track this with me, but if this will be another document that I will add to the Patreon page, Choralosophy Patreon page. That's patreon.com/Choralosophy, and you'll have access to these documents as well. So the rubric, the one I'm going to put on the Patreon page is going to be personalized. This is the one that our school district uses. So I'm going to use it to explain, and then I'm going to personalize one onto a Google Doc there that you can make as shareable, similar to the rubric that we heard about before for the daily grade. So this one, because this one's got some things that make it tricky to read, and so I'm going to simplify it. So the first category is pitches and rhythms. So they come down, they have their music. We usually don't make it be memorized because we want them to, we want to encourage the idea that they're going to take notes and they're going to, it's going to be an open book test, and we want them to really concentrate on the way they're singing and not just the notes and rhythms. Although, as we all know, it's not worth a whole lot to sing beautifully if the song's not correct. So we do grade on notes and rhythms, but we go beyond that. So the first category is notes and rhythms. They can either get a 4, a 3, a 2, a 1, or a 0. A 4 we define as no errors in pitch and rhythm. And when we say no errors, that means no notes were a little bit too long, or a little bit too short, or a little bit sharp, or a little bit flat. It was dead on, computer perfect the whole time. And we had to have been able to hear you the whole time. So verifiably correct exactly all the time. Which, as you can imagine, in high school, that actually doesn't happen very often, especially when you pull down kids into groups of only 2 on a part. Right? So sometimes we can trick ourselves into thinking that the section is singing it perfectly, but if you were to zoom in to the individual singer level, you'd be hearing lots of tiny little mistakes throughout most high school choirs, even really good ones. So this breaks them down into 2 on a part, or you can really hear which kid is making the mistake, or in which one isn't, or maybe they all are, that kind of thing. So that's a 4. And then still in notes and rhythms category here, you have the category of advancing, which is what we call it. Again, you could call these things, when you get the Google Doc version, you could rename it and call it anything that makes sense, any of the buzzwords that happen in your school district. So I'm going to explain now this 3 category, which is, again, if they made any mistakes at all, they can't be in the 4 category. So the first mistake puts them into a 3. Over the course of 30 measures, if there's only a handful of tiny little discrepancies, then we can keep them in that 3 category. But they need to be non-recurring type of errors. So, the cutoff at the end was a beat too early. Okay, well, that's a 3, but it just was super rare, so that's not going to hurt their score overall very much. Then over here in the 2 category, that's where you're dealing with, say, every line of music has a mistake. Let's say there's 5 or 6 measures of music on a line, and there's some type of error at the top of the page, at the bottom of the page, the middle of the page. Like there's on every line of music, there is some type of error. So it's occasional. It's not. This person has not bombed the test, but there are recurring types of mistakes going on. Then if you get into that, so that would be a 2. If you get into the 1 category, you're talking about a kid who is making mistakes of pitch and rhythm every few measures. So every other measure, every 2 or 3 measures. So multiple times per line, right? So it's pretty easy to break down. And when what's cool about that way of doing it is you're not counting mistakes. You don't have to sit there with a tally pad and with each kid start marking off mistakes. In a short test, you're gonna remember. If you get better at this, by the way, the more you do it, you start to remember, okay, that kid flew through that entire thing and it was just spot on. Or you'll start to remember that kid made just a mistake. Other than that, it was. So these are very broad categories, right? These are not the type of things where you're going to say, the kid's going to come back to you and say, I got to be on the test. Where was my mistake? Well, that's not the rubric. The rubric is not telling them that they're going to get feedback on what measures did they make the mistake. Now, if you remember and you can give them that feedback, great. But the big thing is they're getting an idea, a picture of how accurate over time were their notes and rhythms, right? So that's valuable, and it's also quick and easy to grade. The next category is proper tone production. So tone production, which we include vowel shapes, diction, and expression, along with the resonance part of tone production. So a 4 is advanced skills of proper tone production. This kid, if they're getting a 4, they sound like a grown darn adult. They're probably in your state an all-stater. They're one of your top singers. They're probably headed to college on a vocal scholarship, because advanced skills would be, that's what I'd be describing, right? So those would be the kids who are consistently singing, like every vowel is pure and formant rich. It's overtone rich. There is expressivity going on all the time. They are singing as if they ought to be paid to sing. So again, you're noticing a theme. I don't give many 4s. That's a pretty rare gift, and usually my all-staters, their second or third test their senior year, are getting their 4s for the first time. Then you get into the 3. So this is where most of your good singers will be. Proficient skills of proper tone production. Proficient meaning they've shown that they can do those things the all-staters can do. They're not doing them all the time yet, but it's starting to become a pretty common feature of their voice and of their performance practice, that they are shaping their vowels clearly, performing diction elements, and they're expressive most of the time. The emerging category means that all of those things we just discussed, they can do them. Like every once in a while, they'll bust out this beautiful note. It's got some resonance and maybe some vibrato if the style of music calls for that. There is a mature sound happening every once in a while, but it's just it's not there all the time, so it's inconsistent. A developing student is making an effort to do those things, but it's just not happening. right? So this is maybe the freshman girl who can't get her folds to approximate, and every single sound is breathy all the time. You can't hear everything, fades in and out. Mouth isn't moving very much yet. So you don't hear any words or any diction being, and they're just staring at their folder and they're not expressive at all. So that'd be your 1. I'm saving the zeros for last on purpose, don't worry. And the third category, final category, is the ensemble singing skills category. So is the student out of their book as much as possible? Are they interacting with the audience and with their neighbors? Are they looking at each other for cutoffs and onsets, those types of things? Because we don't conduct the singing test. We're too busy grading. So are they singing as part of an ensemble? This is also where you can tie in some elements of balance, blend, and ensemble intonation with your advanced kids. This is the category that probably the younger kids struggle with the most because they want to come up and stare at their folders, right? So this is the category that I would say needs the most coaching at the beginning, but it also just takes time. So most of my freshmen live in the 1 and 2 on this one at the beginning, and that's okay. So for a 4, the kids at the upper levels sometimes come up, they've just decided that they're going to have their test memorized, because when they come up that way, they can not look at their music at all, they can interact with each other, they can really listen and focus on each other's singing, and that would be a 4. And again, the same system happens. If they frequently do those things, they're getting a 3. If they occasionally do them, they're getting a 2. And if they are doing it almost never, little evidence is what we call it, of those ensemble singing skills, they're getting a 1. Now a 0 is something in any of those 3 categories that we might give if we, in the language we use, is if we see the student seldom created any audible sound and displayed little visible effort. We might give a 0 in any or all of those categories. And with the younger kids, sometimes that does happen. They're nervous and or they're just unwilling. In most cases, though, the reality is they simply are not prepared. So that is the reality. If we tell the kids that do well are the ones who go home and sing their part at home. And they record themselves, they grade it back. So that way when they come up to do the test, they're not wondering in the back of their mind if they can do this. They know they can do it. And they just have to fight through those nerves rather than I'm singing in front of my friends, but I also don't even know if I know the song by myself or in a small group. Have I really been following everybody the whole time? I don't know. Well, I guess I'll find out after the test. Well, of course you're not going to get a very good grade. Now down here you can see that we have a way to translate those rubric scores into a grade. And for those of you listening on the podcast, this will be pretty easy to follow. We have 3 levels of choir at my school, so this might be tweakable to however your school is set up. We have advanced choirs, intermediate choirs, and beginning choirs. Each of the levels needs a different amount of points to get a good grade on the rubric, which is why a lot of those things, if the kids in all 3 of those categories are getting 2s and 1s, your first thought might be, my goodness, my kids would get crushed. Their grades would plummet if we tested like this. Well, that's why we create a progressive scale, where a beginning student doesn't need as many points on the rubric to get an A as an advanced student. And over the course of their time in choir, in high school, or in college, if you choose to use this, they're going to be singing harder songs, but they're also going to be better singers. So a lot of these types of skills, they're going to be reflecting more frequently, and those rubric points will start to come up as they should, because if they're not progressing, something's wrong. Right? Something about their preparation is wrong. So you can see here that there is a shift. I'm going to go right to the middle to the 6 through 8 category. So if you're a beginning student and you get a 6 on the rubric, so that would be a 2 in each category. Right? Occasional minor errors, emerging skills of proper tone production, and occasional ensemble singing skills. So for a beginning student, it's a solid B minus. Now, this is a hard thing to test, right? So that's okay to not get A's on everything. If you want to get an A freshman, you got to go home and practice. And then you might get the 9 or 10 on the rubric. But if they've never practiced, a 6 would be a pretty darn good score. That means they kind of pretty much know their part, and they're starting to show that they've got some singing techniques happening, right? But if you're in my concert choir, and you're still that inconsistent with the way you're singing, I'm less sympathetic with you, in which case you're going to get a 75%. Okay, so the expectation of the way they sing goes up over time. If you're in the intermediate class, then that 6 is an 80%, so a little bit lower of a B minus. So that whole scale, if you're just listening on the podcast and you would like to ask some questions about how we break that all down, feel free to shoot me an email at choralosophy@gmail.com. But of course, if you're on the YouTube channel, that's the best way to see that. You'll have plenty of time to jot that all down. Okay, last but not least, the concert grade. I am going to strongly suggest that we move past show up and get an A expectation. I think kids expect it. There is a certain sense of entitlement, and anytime I start to smell entitlement in my choir room, something's going to get more challenging. And so that's one of the ones that went first for me, was the automatic 100-point show up, get your 10% of your grade for the semester, whatever you choose to do at your school. They've got to show up and do stuff. Like, there's got to be some boxes to check. And now, of course, I also know that the last thing we need to add on a concert night is a complicated rubric to keep track of for a whole bunch of kids. So that's not what we do. It's very simple. It's a 3-element rubric that are pass-fail. And so the rubric points are 1 or 0. You either get it, you don't get it. There's no sliding scale. You didn't kind of get it. And that even goes for the first category, which is show up on time and in uniform. 6:30 is the call time. At 6:35, you have a C. You're on time. So come early and be there on time. So on time and in uniform means that they lose. That's a category. So they have to do both of those things to get those 25 points. Another 25 points is for the audience behavior. So audience etiquette. Are you a good audience member? Are you engaged in the other student's performance, or are you on your phone, wandering around through the Performing Arts Center, leaving and coming back all the time? Just anything that might get your name written down as the naughty list, as we call it. That's another 25%. Points are gone if your name goes on that list. If you are then keeping track of the math, that leaves 50 points. So the other 50 points happen on stage. So whether or not you are an engaged performer, that's the other half. And we define that the same way we had defined it back at the beginning of the episode or middle or so when we were talking about the rehearsal rubric. Engaged means mentally plugged in, physically plugged in to the performance. So you've all got this kid. He comes up on stage and cocks his head to the side and just, eyes are dead, barely moving his mouth. I am way too cool to sing. Let's go for a sleigh ride, a wonderful sleigh ride, and hurry along with the song, a wintry world to glide. And then, of course, he would come off the stage and assume he's got an A on the concert because he showed up. Well, no, we've got a video evidence that you were not engaged in the concert. You were phoning it in. You just failed. So it's a failing grade for the concert because he would have lost those 50 points. So another way to do the math would be the kid does all the stuff that he's supposed to do during the concert, but was wearing pink socks and arrived at 6:40. Well, he's got a C then, right? So he lost those 25 points. Now that's, again, very harsh, but when kids understand that expectation is not going to go away, they will do it. We had the shortest naughty list ever at a concert at our last concert. I was very proud of the kids. So it can be done, and it teaches them that they need to be held accountable. So that's the end of the episode. I am very appreciative that you stuck around to the end. This was another nuts and bolts episode. As I discussed a couple times ago, not all the episodes will go this way, where we just really dig into the music education stuff, but people seem to enjoy the sight reading one, so I thought I would do one on assessment, and I hope you got something out of it. If you did, please leave a rating on a podcast app or on YouTube. Subscribe on whatever app or system that you're watching on. And another great way to support the show, if you really, really want to, and we hope you do, is to share the episodes. Tell your friends. Send a link. Shoot an email to your district's email list of other directors. Say, hey, I found this resource, and you might get something out of it too. Check it out. Anything that you can do to help spread the word is very, very appreciated. Other things that you can do, of course, are in the Apple Podcast app or any other podcast app is to rate and leave a review of some kind. So if you actually take the 30 seconds rather than the 1 second of clicking the 5-star to go in and say, leave a comment, and then just say something that you enjoyed, or even if you didn't like something. It's still helpful for me to get the feedback, and it's also helpful for the algorithm to see that the show is being actively participated with, and that's very helpful. And then, of course, if you are super into it, there is also the Patreon option, which allows you to support the show directly as a Patreon subscriber. For as little as $3 a month, you can become part of the inner circle, so to speak, of on the Patreon. And the benefits there are kind of cool in the sense that you get to some access to some Patreon-only episodes. There are 3 on there right now, and those are very behind-the-scenes types of episodes. A lot of what I'm thinking about when I'm not live with you all. And then also some of the resources that I'm posting with some of these nuts and bolts episodes are going to be available for subscribers only on Patreon. So head over to patreon.com/Coralosophy if you would like to be a part of that. Thank you so much, and see you next time.